The Gemara tells us on Daf Daled Amud Aleph that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, Nashim chayavos b'mikra Megillah. Women are obligated in reading the Megillah. Why? Sha'af hein hayu ba'osanes. They were also beneficiaries of that miracle. This is how most Rishonim understand it, that because the Gzeira, the decree, was out against all the Jewish people, so the men were saved, the women were saved, and therefore women have an equal obligation in Mikra Megillah, in reading the Megillah, as men do. Or so it would seem that their obligation is the same as that of men, and that's what Tosfos points out. Mikan mashma, Tosfos says, from here the implication is that women have an equal obligation, and they can be motzi acherim yidei chavas, they can be motzi, they can fulfill the obligation for a man, they can read the Megillah for a man, because they're equal level of obligation. When a man and a woman have an equal level of obligation, they can be motzi each other with brachos, or like, let's say, kiddush, because they have equal obligation. And Tosfos says that's what's implied over here. And because it doesn't say a difference, it says they're obligated in Mikra Megillah and reading the Megillah. It doesn't say they're obligated in just hearing the Megillah. And therefore it sounds like they have an equal obligation. And Tosfos points out that that's also the implication of the Gemara at the beginning of Erechin. The Gemara there on Daf Beis Amud Beis says that the Mishnah there said, Hakol chayavim b'Mikra Megillah. Everybody's obligated in Mikra Megillah. And the Gemara asked, who's this? And it said, Hakol ksherim likros Megillah. It says everybody is kosher to read the Megillah. So who's this Hakol? Who's everybody? The Gemara says, Lasuye nashim, to include women, that women are obligated in reading the Megillah, and they're kosher to read the Megillah. And it quotes our Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Sha'afing hayu ba'osanes, they were also beneficiaries of the miracle. And so it seems they have an equal obligation. Indeed, Rashi in Erechin says that that it comes to include women, that they are obligated in the Mikra Megillah, uksherus likrosa, and they are kosher, permitted to read it, lahotzi zecharim yidei chavasang, even for males who would be listening to fulfill their obligation. So that's how it would seem. The problem is that there is a Tosefta that says otherwise, and Tosfos asks from this Tosefta, both Tosfos in Megillah and Tosfos in Erechin, and the Tosefta says explicitly that Nashim avadim uktarim p'turim mikriyas Megillah. It says that women are exempt from Mikra Megillah, from reading the Megillah. So this Tosefta seems to be a contradiction with our Gemara that says women are chayavos b'Mikra Megillah, they're obligated. The Tosefta says women are p'turin, they're exempt from reading the Megillah. So one of the ways that the Rishonim reconcile this is based on a Bahag. The Bahag says, Tosfos quotes it, the Bahag, the Baal Halachos Gedolo, says that women are chayev in Shmiya, they're obligated to hear the Megillah, because they were saved as well. And when we say that women are chayev to read the Megillah, what we mean is they're chayev to hear the Megillah, and when we say that they're ksherim likros, that they're allowed to read it, really what we mean is they can read it for other women, but they cannot read it for men because they have a different obligation. Their obligation really is shmiya, to hear it, but yet they can read it for each other. I guess the reading that a woman would do is enough to affect a shmiya for herself and for other women, a hearing, and they could be yotzei that way. So that's how the Bahag kind of reconciles these different sources. Women are chayev in Megillah, they're obligated in Megillah, but that's only to hear the Megillah. And when it says that they're kosher likros, that they can read it, it means they can read it for each other, but they cannot read it for a man. For a man to be yotzei, he has a different obligation. His obligation is kriyas Megillah, to read the Megillah. When one man reads for another man, so he can be yotzei reading it because of shomea ka'ona. It's as if when he hears it, it's as if he's saying it. He's reading it himself when he hears it. But he can only do that from somebody who is of equal level of chiyuv, someone with equal level of obligation. So a man will have to hear it from a man and couldn't hear it from a woman. That's the position of the Bahag, and as we mentioned, it's directly arguing on Rashi, because Rashi said that understood the Gemara in Erechin Kipshuto, the simple understanding, which is that women can read on behalf of men. The Ravya, the Mordechai quotes the Ravya, goes a step further based on this Bahag, and he says that if a woman's obligation is to hear the Megillah, then her bracha should seemingly be a different bracha. If a woman would be, let's say, certainly if, let's say, a man was already Yotzei, he already read the Megillah, so he doesn't need a bracha. He's just reading for women, so the Ravya says, so the women are going to be the ones to make the bracha, and the Ravya says that the bracha would be, instead of the normal bracha, which is al mikra Megillah, on reading the Megillah, but a woman doesn't have a mitzvah of mikra Megillah, according to this, and so if she were the one making the bracha, so she would make the bracha al mishma Megillah, on hearing the Megillah. That's what the Mordechai quotes from the Ravya. Now, we have this major machlokus, this major dispute as to the obligation of a woman when it comes to Megillah, and the Shulchan Aruch paskins that first he says in general that one has to hear the Megillah from somebody who himself or perhaps herself has an obligation, and therefore, if the reader is either is somebody who's a katan, who's a child, or a shoteh, or somebody who has no intellect, so they don't have a mitzvah, they can't be motzi somebody else. And he doesn't mention women there. And then he says, V'yesh omrim, this is in Siman Taf Reish Pei Tes, Sif Beis. Then the Shulchan Aruch says, and women, V'yesh omrim, and some say, Shehanashim eina motzios es hanashim. So in the first opinion he brings, he doesn't mention, it seems to assume women could be motzi, could read for men. But then he says, Yesh omrim, there are those who say that they cannot be motzi men. And there's different rules about how to paskin how to rule when the Shulchan Aruch brings two opinions, but here, as I understand, since the second one is not directly arguing on anything that the first one said, because he didn't explicitly say in the first opinion that women could read, he didn't mention women, so we would rule like the second idea, the Yesh Omrim, that like the Bahag, we're at least concerned for that opinion, and a woman would not be able to read the Megillah for a man. And the Ramah there adds in, based on this idea from the Ravya, that there are those who say that if she's reading for herself, she should make the bracha lishmoa Megillah, to hear the Megillah, rather than al mikra Megillah, because she doesn't have an obligation of mikra, of reading, rather her obligation is shmiya, is listening. Now, the implication is that if it's just women, like we said, they could read for themselves. However, there is a Zohar. The Magen Avraham mentions a Zohar that a woman lo tikra atzma rak tishma me'anashim, that she should not read for herself. The Zohar they don't bring down the reason, but that it could be a reason based in Kabbalah. If it's in a Zohar, that it's better, certainly preferable for a woman in general, not to read the Megillah for herself, but to listen to it from a man. The poskim give different, more practical reasons. Actually, no, those would be for why she shouldn't. Okay, that's a different story. Okay, fine. So that's mentioned by the Magen Avraham, and Mishnah Berurah brings that down, and he adds, though, that's of course if there is someone for whom the woman to hear Megillah from. But if she doesn't have anyone to hear Megillah from, then there's no man to read it for her. So then it's certainly better to read it herself so that she can fulfill the obligation. We wouldn't say based on this Zohar she shouldn't read it at all. If there's nobody to read it, then she should indeed read it herself. Okay, now it's a kind of an interesting split that we end up with, because we end up with this idea that men have a mitzvah of kriya, and women have a mitzvah of shmiya. A man could be motzi, could read on behalf of a woman cannot read on behalf of a man. Now some give a very practical explanation for that. They say that it's kol isha for a woman to read for a man, and that's why she can't read, that the Kaf HaChaim brings down, and that's the machlokus here. That's what's for debate here. Is her reading the Megillah considered kol isha? Is that like singing, or reading the Megillah is not like singing and it would be okay. That could be what they're arguing about over here. The Mishnah Berurah mentions an idea that it's not kavod tzibur, it's not the honor of the congregation for a woman to read. But at the end of the day, we end up with this split, and the Turei Even wonders why. The Turei Even, commenting on Tosfos and Megillah, he asks, at the end of the day, Afeng Hayubos Hanes, they were part of the same miracle. Usually when we apply that concept, that it allows even for women to be motzi men. For example, this concept is applied also by Neres Chanukah, by lighting the Chanukah candles. That there we say that men and women are equally obligated, because Afeng Hayubos Hanes. I should just mention one idea, right? In general, we say women are exempt from time-bound mitzvahs. Mitzvahs aseh shazman grama. So these are exceptions to that, where we say they should still be obligated because Afeng Hayubos Hanes, the miracle was applicable to them as well. So we say that by Chanukah, and not only that, but women can light on behalf of men. The custom generally in a household is that the husband lights, but if he's not home, or even if, technically speaking, the wife is allowed to light. She can fulfill the obligation for the household. So why, when it comes to Megillah, would there be any difference? Why would we say that a man can be motzi a woman, but a woman cannot be motzi a man? And then he adds a second question is, and even if we say that, but what's this idea of a woman's obligation is for shmiya but not of kriya? It's to hear it but not to read it. It sounds like a strange idea. Where did that come from? That she has a different type of obligation, a different sort of geder, a different way to define a woman's obligation when it comes to Megillah. And the truth is that second question he rejects, and he says, the Turei Even says that I think that there's no difference. She doesn't have an obligation of shmiya, of hearing. She also has an obligation of kriya, of reading, but it's just a different level of obligation. But before we get to the Turei Even, in the notes on the Turei Even, Hagos Baruch Tam, from Baruch Frankel Tumim, he suggests a very novel idea to explain why a woman would have a different type of obligation than a man. And that is based on the Gemara later in the Masechta, in Megillah, on Daf Yudalid 14a, where the Gemara asks that where did the sages see that they would be allowed to enact like a new mitzvah of reading the Megillah. The Gemara there says that we find there were all these Nevi'im, all these prophets that prophesied, and they didn't add any mitzvahs in the Navi, chutz mimikra Megillah, except for Megillah. And the Gemara asks, "My darush, where did they get that idea from? Where did they darshan? Where did they derive this idea that they should enact a mitzvah of reading the Megillah?" And the Gemara says, "Amar B'chia bar Avin, Amar B'Yeshua ben Karcha," that they made the following logical deduction. They said, "Umame avdus l'cheiros amrinan shira." If when we left Mitzrayim and we crossed the Yam Suf, we went from slavery to freedom, we said shira, we sang a song, mimisa l'chayim l'kol shekain. When we went from death to life, all the more so we should say a song, and the Megillah is the song, the equivalent of Az Yashir that we sing at the sea. So the sages saw if we did that when we were rescued from slavery to freedom, so certainly when we were rescued from death, annihilation to life, we should also have a shira, have a song, and that is the Megillah. The Megillah is that song. That is the source that the Gemara brings that the sages found for enacting the reading of the Megillah. Says the Baruch Tam, based on this, well, if you look at what happened at the Yam Suf, so the psukim there say that, the psukim there imply that only the men actually sang shira at the Yam Suf, meaning it was only all the men who sang, because there we have Az Yashir Moshe u'Bnei Yisrael. Then Moshe and Bnei Yisrael and the men along, they sang together, and Rashi says that Moshe would say and the men would respond. However, Rashi continues, but that Miriam amra shira lanashim, that only Miriam sang a shira amongst the women, because it says Vatan lahem Miriam, and Miriam responded. But it doesn't say that the other women responded back. So at the Yam Suf, as Yashir, which is the source, that from which we derive the idea of saying Megillah, the men were all mikra. They all read it. They all said it out loud, and so we derive from there that men have an obligation of kriyas Megillah as well, of actually reading it. Again, we don't all read it. We could do Shomea Ka'ona. We could hear it, and it's like we're saying it, but that we have an obligation as men of mikra Megillah. But at the Yam Suf, only Vatan La Miriam. Only Miriam was the one who sang, but all the other women just listened. And so we derive from there that women have an obligation to hear the shira, to hear the song, but not to actually sing it. And so too by Megillah, they have an obligation of shmiya and not of kriya. That is the suggestion, very novel, beautiful suggestion from the Agos Baruch Tam. However, the Tur Yevon himself says, no, there's no difference. Everybody has an obligation of mikra Megillah, but it's a different level of obligation for men and for women. And that is because the obligation of kriyas Megillah is something enacted by, as we said, by the Nevi'im, by the prophets of that time, with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration. And he says certainly the way that they would enact it would be Ke'ein Torah, just like Torah obligations. Now we find, when it comes to Torah obligations, we know that, as we mentioned, that women are exempt from mitzvah sasei shazman grama. Women are exempt from positive time-bound mitzvahs, except for a few exceptions, where we have special drashos, like eating matzah on Pesach, and Kiddush on Shabbos, and certain ones where we have special ways to derive that they are actually obligated. But in general, women are exempt from mitzvah sasei shazman grama, and therefore, the original enactment of Mikra Megillah was only for men as a time-bound mitzvah, and not for women. However, the rabbis later came along, and they applied this idea of Afeng Hayabos Anes, because we find this idea only by Dirabanan, only by rabbinic mitzvahs. Tosfos points this out. We don't say about matzah. Matzah women are obligated for a different reason, from a drasha. Why don't we say, because Afeng Hayabos Anes, they were also saved from Egypt. Why do we need a special drasha? The answer is it only applies by Dirabanans. It was a rabbinic idea. The rabbis enacted it by certain things. So we find it by the rabbinic mitzvah of lighting Hanukkah candles, and we find it by the rabbinic mitzvah of drinking 4 cups of wine at the Seder, and we find it by Mikra Megillah. But it's a rabbinic addition to the already existing obligation that came from the Nevi'im. And therefore, says the Tur Yevon, men and women have a different level of obligation when it comes to Mikra Megillah. A man's obligation comes from Ruach HaKodesh, comes from the original enactment of the Nevi'im of the time, at the time of the Megillah, and it only applied to men, and a woman's obligation came later as a result of a rabbinic enactment that said, since they were also part of the miracle, they should also be obligated. But since it's a different level of chiyuv, a different level of obligation, so when you have different levels, when you have a higher level of obligation and a lower level, meaning we have an obligation that's an obligation based in Ruach HaKodesh, that's the original enactment, that's the obligation of men to read the Megillah. And then you have a rabbinic enactment later that women should also have an obligation. Well, that lower level obligation, only somebody who's obligated on the same level can be motzi, can fulfill the obligation for somebody else. And since a woman's obligation is like a lower level obligation, so she's not able to be motzi, she can't read on behalf of a man. But a man who has a higher level obligation is able to be motzi, both those on his own level of obligation, other men, as well as women who have a lower level of obligation. And that, says the Tur Yevon, is the reason for this discrepancy that men can be motzi. Men can read on behalf of a woman, but a woman may not read on behalf of a man, but a woman could read on behalf of another woman, because a woman's obligation is, because 2 women are on equal level of obligation.